now just approaching the second wonder, which appears in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. You might want to take a look at it in your own Bible so you can remember the location with respect to 1140, chapter 11, verse 40, beginning the events of the last days, and then following through to chapter 12, verse 7, which appears to me to break down into 7 amazing, miraculous, and conspicuous miraculous events at the time of the end. As we pointed out in the first class, they're not in chronological order. They can't be. So we have reordered them, wonder number 1, 2, 3, and so on, in the order that they will take place chronologically. We've spent the last 4 weeks speaking about the resurrection because that's the first thing Paul tells us in Thessalonians the Lord does. When the order is given from heaven for Christ to return, he sends his angels out to resurrect the dead and then to gather his elect from the four corners of the earth. Jesus picks up on this idea in Matthew 24, only he's referring to 2 ingatherings that are separate and distinct from each other in the work of Christ. One ingathering is that of the saints to the judgment seat, all those who have been resurrected and then were alive at the time of the second coming of Christ and are brought to the judgment seat of Christ. And then the other ingathering is after he's done a bit of work with his host with respect to the armies that have led a charge against Jerusalem, he gathers all the Jews from the four corners of the earth. And because there are 2 witnesses in this world, the unwitting witnesses of the wandering Jews in the last days, and the very witting witnesses of those who hold the truth, that is not of Christianity, but of the followers of Christ and the natural Israel. So you could make that distinction like this: natural and spiritual Israel being 2 witnesses in this world. There's an ingathering for both of them, and they are separate. So that means there are 2 elect of God, and what elect means is chosen ones. So there are 2 sets of people who have been chosen to represent God's will in this world. One is Israel, and the other are the followers of Christ. And so they are both referred to as the elect. So the context and the theme in the writing is what tells us which is which. Daniel is about one, Matthew 25 is about both. Actually, Daniel is about both because he speaks about the resurrection and judgment. So both Daniel and Matthew 24 speak about the elect as being natural Israel on one hand and spiritual Israel on the other hand. So let's look at Daniel 12, verse 1, and just read this section of the prophecy. And at that time shall Michael stand up. If you're using an English Standard Version of the Bible, it says, at that time shall arise Michael. And so there are 2 different expressions to describe what he does, what Michael does. The first one is that he stands up. That's in the King James Version. And in the English Standard Version, he arises. Well, it just so happens that both of those terms used to describe what Michael does at the time of the second coming of Christ are significant to the meaning of what it's describing when it says Michael stands up. Because, as you know, the word anastasis, the word used throughout the New Testament for resurrection, means stand up. That's what the word means. So, if you've been dead for a few thousand years, and an angel goes into the innermost parts of the earth and recomposes your body and puts you back together, memories and all, and lays you on the ground, my picture of, this is just personal to me, my picture of the resurrection is there's a command that is made at the point at which you become aware that you've just woken up from a long sleep, the sleep of death, and it's time now to come back to life. And that is, there's a command that sounds like this: Speaking of my mother, for example. She's laying on the ground. She's next to my father, also laying next to her. They are possibly hearing the sounds of the environment in which they are lying, probably on the ground someplace, possibly by their cemetery. And an angel says, Esther, stand up. Tony, stand up. Wouldn't that be just the most fascinating thing to actually participate in a resurrection from the dead with those words, stand up? So the word for resurrection in the New Testament is so fitting when it says, in its literal meaning, stand up. It's just so perfectly chosen by God to say what he plans to do. So then there's this other word used by the English Standard Version. At that time shall arise Michael, the prince of my people. So why would arise be significant to the same thing? Because the resurrection involves more than just a personal resurrection. You know, for example, Ezekiel 37 speaks about the dry bones prophecy, and that is the national resurrection of Israel from the dead. It's a metaphor, and these bones connect up, and Israel comes back to life. We understand that to have taken place when out of the masses of world population, Jews during World War II were driven back to the Holy Land under the auspices of England, having turned over that land through the Balfour Declaration to Israel as a potential site for a future nation. It was just after World War I, but then a little while later in World War II, they were driven back because of the Holocaust. And it was in 1948, just 3 years after the end of World War II, you remember that Israel was declared to be a state. We understood that to mean that the nation of Israel as a nation, a people who are actually organized into a nation, came back to life, fulfilling the dry bones prophecy in Ezekiel 37. So that's another resurrection that takes place, or rising. But there's yet another one, and that's when Michael stands up. That's the subject of our class this morning, why the word arise is fitting. It correlates also to that verse in the center of last chapter in the Old Testament, Malachi 4, where it says that the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in his wings, using that same word arise. And you shall go forth as calves from the stall. Those two events are the rising of Christ's authority, and the view the world will have when, as it says in Revelation chapter 1, every eye sees him. This rising is the rising of the power of Christ in the political heavens of this world. And so it's such a beautiful figure of speech, though, to refer to the Son of God as the Son of Righteousness, spelled S-U-N, correlating that with the rising of the sun in the dawn of the morning, when the dew materializes on the green verdure of the earth, and as the atmosphere warms and the sun goes higher and higher in the sky, it warms to a point where they rise and form a cloud, and at that point the cloud and the sun and the bow in the cloud, which is the full spectrum of Christ's overarching power in the world, become visible in the eyes of all the nations. These figures are so lofty and so beautiful that they just reduce you to tears if you think about how literal this is in terms of what will actually take place. And how no man could have dreamed up such a description of a plan fulfilled in the future. This is not something any man would conjure up from his imagination. It's just so opposite of the mythologies of the world. So once again, returning to the text, there's just a brief commentary on the two versions, and one saying stand up, using the word anastasis, and the other saying arise, referring to the rising of Christ in the political powers of the world. So to finish the verse, it says, at that time Michael shall stand up, the great prince, which stands for the children of thy people. He stands for them, and And in this case, the children of thy people refers to the children of Israel, the children of God's people who are Israel. So this is in the context of a huge problem in the world that develops in Israel when Israel becomes the source of a controversy that affects all the nations in the region and becomes a stumbling block thereof, as it says in Zechariah. So there shall be a time of trouble for Israel and for the world, and we're experiencing that trouble on our own level right now. Time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. That's describing another wonder, which we'll get to later on. So let's go back and just focus on the simplicity of the statement, at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which stands for the children of thy people. Okay, so the great prince, we understand, is Christ. And when he stands for the children of thy people, that is the children of Israel, that is the generation that has descended from Abraham, that are still alive in the last days of the time of the coming of Christ, when he stands for them, they recognize him as their Messiah. So let's go back to the presentation here and take a look at this wonder. Michael stands up. So why is that a wonder specifically? You remember wonder being defined as conspicuous, miraculous events in this context pertaining to the second coming of Christ. What makes Michael standing up a miraculous event? This is not like the ways of providence where you feel like God helped you make a decision about which city to move to, what house to buy, what job to get, decisions you might make about your marriage or your children. This is not like, and sometimes we describe even our healings as miracles because we want there to be miracles, but these are the real deal kind of miracles. Those kind of miracles that are so astonishing in the natural world which we live that we can hardly believe our eyes when we see them. Something on the level of the parting of the waters of the Red Sea, or Jesus rising from his grave 3 days after he was crucified. Miracles on a large level. Things that are conspicuous that if anyone saw it would say, this is something only God can do. Okay? The power of God manifested visibly in his hand as he works his plan. So that's what we mean when we say conspicuous miracles. So why is Michael standing up a conspicuous miracle? Because we know from the context that this is kind of a metaphor for something. It doesn't appear, at least to me, to be literally Michael the archangel, although some brothers think that it is, on one hand, and on the other hand, is standing up. I mean, the most literal application you could put to that is if Jesus is taking the place, metaphorically, of Michael, the prince of his people, and he stands up, he stands in that day, his feet stand in that day on the Mount of Olives, like it says in Zechariah 14. So that's another kind of standing up too. He stands up in a way that Israel recognizes him as their Messiah. And it literally says his feet will literally stand in that day on the Mount of Olives. And the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. So this is why this is a wonder. Because it's the consolidation. When Michael's standing up is a metaphor for the consolidation, this coalescing of the image of God in this world in a very visible way at the time that the image of man consolidates in an attempt to gain control of the whole world. So you have this interesting contrast of type and antitype that we've been speaking about for the last 2 weeks of the image of man and the image of God both standing up at the same time in world history to see who it is that will rule over men. Will it be the king of the kingdoms of men? Or will it be the king that God has chosen of the kingdom of God? And we know the answer to that question. Otherwise, there's no plan and purpose. So that's why it's a wonder, because that's never happened before. This metaphor of David and Goliath becomes a metaphor of the image of God at war with the image of man, or vice versa, I think would be a more appropriate way to put it. So the point is, it's a consolidation, because when the saints stand up, Michael stands up. So it's concomitant. It's the second thing that occurs after the resurrection and judgment. The resurrection and judgment take place so that Christ can become the Lord of hosts. At that point, Michael has to stand up in order to begin the work of subjugating the nations to God's authority, which authority they have never recognized. So when the saints stand up in the resurrection, that enables Christ, the Lord of hosts, to stand up as Michael. So having joined together with those who are like God, Christ is like God, right? He's in the image of his Father. And we are supposed to be transformed into the image of his Son. That puts us all in a sequence in the image of God. And that makes us more like God than we would have been in our natural mind. So whatever thing you're wrestling with right now, whatever difficulty or trial, all of that is going into the development of your mind as a mind more like Christ and less like yourself. That puts you in the image of God, and that makes you like Christ. If you are like Christ, you are like God. So who is like God? Well, Christ, the first fruits of them that slept, and those that are Christ's at his coming. They are those who are like God. And Christ, therefore, stands up as Michael with the saints. So this idea of Christ as Messiah, yes, is individual to him, but it also is inclusive of the saints. Jesus is not a singular term everywhere he's referred to. Jesus of Nazareth was a singular person. But when Paul says, you are Christ, he's referring to a plurality of people who have been enough like Christ to become a larger picture of a larger entity than just a single man. But that entity is so unified by sameness of mind, by being of the same mind and judgment, or as Jesus put it in his prayer, by being one. They are so entirely unified in that mind that Christ is really a collective of people with himself as the head. And that's why Paul refers to Jesus as the head of a body which is all knit together as one thing. So that we are this collection of people who become the hosts of whom Christ is Lord is also one body. It's been pointed out that when my first memory verse, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, Deuteronomy 6:4. That when God said, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, he's referring to God as a unity with his power, with his Son, and with those that are like him at his coming. So it's a high calling we're in right here, to be like Christ. But that's what this means. When Michael stands up, having joined together with those who are like God, Christ stands up as Michael with the saints. So now, a reasonable question. Why is Christ, and if you want to take it to the bigger picture that we've been describing, Christ and the saints, why are they described as Michael, the great prince who stands for my people? And Michael, you know, is an archangel that has a very significant role in the development of God's plan, and it's outworking over time as Michael the archangel works not only with Israel, but in the sense of Daniel, with the nations that are involved, the natural, ungodly nations that Israel is involved with, like Babylon and Greece. And Michael is very much involved in God's outworking with them as well. And there's even a place in Daniel where the angel is speaking to Daniel, and he says, well, I had to go and fight against the king of Persia, and then after him, I'll be fighting against the king of Greece. Sounding as if giving us a kind of a real inside look at the way angels operate. They kind of have to work with natural men who have a delusion of power and grandeur about themselves, but to cause them to bring about God's will, because he is actually in control of them. So you look at the powerful men in the world today, they think they're in control, but they are actually being moved, as it's described in Daniel, by people like Michael and other angels or angels like Michael and other angels, being moved and motivated to make decisions and take national and international directions with their politics to bring about God's will. He does rule in the kingdoms of men, literally, like that. We can't see how, but that's why we don't get involved in politics. Because God's already got all that in control. He's got the politics of men in the palm of his hand. Men don't do what they really think they want to do. They do what God lets them do on one hand and makes them do on the other. So let's answer this question as comprehensively as we can. Why is Christ called Michael? The word Michael, the great prince, this in the initial sense, this angel who is working out God's will in this world, he's doing that. He's a ministering spirit because he's like God. There is no angel that doesn't have the mind of God in his head. And so they do his bidding. They are extensions of God's mind when they come into the world and they either make an announcement like they did to Abraham that Sodom and Gomorrah was about to be destroyed, or they come to Mary and they say you're going to get pregnant and you're going to have a son, and that son is going to sit on the throne of his father David and rule over the house of Israel forever. And so when they make pronouncements like that, they are expressing the very mind of God, which means they are like God. Jesus said as much when he said in the resurrection, you'll be like the angels who neither marry nor are giving in marriage, neither shall they die. So we know that angels have this very special relationship to God of being in perfect unison with his mind. And that makes them in character, in deed, and in mind like God. So what did Jesus say? He said in the resurrection, you'll be like the angels. So what does that mean? That means in simple terms, in the resurrection, you'll be like God. You've tried to learn how to be like God in wrestling with good and evil, in making choices and understanding the difference and the integration of righteousness and mercy and all these things that we think about day in, day out in our life in Christ. Those things have led us to a point in the resurrection where we'll be like God. And we will become his ministering spirits in his kingdom from his throne. So in this case, who is like God can be read as a question, the answer being Jesus and the saints, the angels first, that would be Michael, then Jesus, then the saints. And it can also be a statement, Jesus and the saints who are like God would be, it's a clause that would follow a definitive statement. The name Michael comes from a literal being. Following that, he becomes a metaphor, which I believe is in Daniel. Some brothers don't see it that way. They think that Daniel is speaking literally about Michael the archangel. It doesn't matter to me how you see this. I'm here to tell you how I see it and why. So Jesus is the express image of his person. All right. So John, I think you're just one slight step ahead of the slide. And we have been talking about that, but if Jesus is in the express, it says in Hebrews that he's in the express image of God's person, then we know that when Paul says in Colossians, in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, that his image involved his character. That's the fullness of God's character, embodied in Jesus as a person who lives in that character. We don't think that means that Jesus as a mortal man, Jesus of Nazareth, looked like his father. Like everybody said, when I was a little boy, I looked just like my father when he was a little boy. That's not the way Jesus was in the image of his father. It was in his character. And so we are non-Trinitarians in that understanding. But if you follow this idea through, it says, beloved, we are now sons of God, and it does not yet appear what we shall be in the day of the resurrection, but we know that when he shall appear, we shall be like him. So you have a two-stage likeness to God. Jesus being made in the express image of his Father, fulfilling the initial statement of the plan, let us make man in our image. And then this promise that when he appears, we'll be like him. And if we're like him, we're like God. So these are two very simple statements in the Bible that make it clear that the answer to the question, who is like God, is Jesus first, and those that are Christ at his coming second. So this is the consolidation of Christ as a body of people, rather than just as the Savior of the world who died on the cross. This is now Jesus as the Lord of a huge host of people. So that's, as I said earlier, the ultimate manifestation, at least at this stage of things. There's one even larger than that, when God is all in all at the end. Then God's name has been fully manifested in this creation. But when he says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God, the Lord is one." It is one body, one God, one faith, one hope, one baptism, one body. But that body consolidates for a very specific purpose that is leading us into the fulfillment of the gospel. And that is, the consolidation of Christ as Lord of hosts is meant for Michael to stand up, or Jesus, using the metaphor to stand up, and face the consolidation of the image, which has been pretty much fragmented and ineffective ever since the king of Babylon, the king of Persia, the king of Greece, and the kings, the Caesars of Rome, sort of came and went and never did come against Christ to battle. In the days, it says in Daniel, in the days of these kings, king of Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, and then the weak and strong nations, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. So how does that happen in the days of these kings if all these kings have come and gone and it never happened? We answered that question a few weeks ago when we said it happens because at the time of the end, these kings and their territories, their dominions, must stand up in a unity together, in a council, if you want to use Revelation 17's language, and come against Christ. They make war with the Lamb because they have consolidated into an image of man. And now Nebuchadnezzar's dream becomes a literal body of a host of people who are now formed into an alliance of nations who make war with Christ. And Christ meets them not as an individual, but as the Lord of hosts. So there are hosts in the image of man, and there are hosts in the image of God. And that contrast and parallel is perfect. It's easy to see once you describe it, but it's perfect as it comes about in the fulfillment of everything we've been looking at in type and antitype and David and Goliath and Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the descriptions in the New Testament and all what the prophets talk about. It's a perfect point and counterpoint, or type and antitype, of this culmination. When Michael stands up, this incredible miracle, Jesus stands up with the saints as the political head of the powers of this world. Well, that's a day we all long for, isn't it? We are so tired of these fake heads of politics that we have to listen to and watch on the news in our own time. The scriptural term for that, as we've said several times now, just take it in, is Yahweh Tsevaoth. There's Yahweh Elohim, mighty ones, and Yahweh Tsevaoth, Lord of hosts. That's what that literally translates. Now, there's another literal translation that is even more descriptive of Christ subjugating, using force to subjugate the nations of this world to his authority, and that is, Lord of hosts means literally Lord of armies. I met this young man in a Bible school one time. We were talking about these things, and he was from Wales, I think. But he had a bit of a Scottish accent, so mom and dad may have been from Scotland or something like that. But he came up to me and his eyes were blazing, and he was just a young man, like he was about 19 years old or something like that. And he goes, "Lord of armies, yes!" And I could see that he had fully digested the drama of the day when Christ becomes Lord of hosts and becomes not this gentle little lamb, but the lion of the tribe of Judah, subjugating the nations with power and force in miraculous event after miraculous event. Because it's by the breath of his lips that he will slay the wicked. I just want to make one little point about the breath of his lips. I had a dream about this one time, but I'm not going to tell you what the dream was, because the point is better than the dream itself. how would Jesus slay the wicked with the breath of his lips? Did you ever think about that? Well, I dreamed about it, but the point of the dream is more important than the dream. He could go like this. And people just drop dead. You remember what happened when there was a turbulence in the sea and Jesus spoke and calmed the seas, which are the turbulence of nations, figuratively speaking. He just looked at the weather, and with all the power of the universe at his disposal, he said, "Peace, be still." And the sea just calmed right down. I suppose it looked glassy. And they said, "Who is this that even the wind and the seas obey him?" Well, he didn't slay anybody when he did that, but it becomes a figure of something which could take place. He could say to an opposing army, "Peace, be still," and the stillness would destroy the army. Not figuratively, literally. When you're dead, you're still. And if all these soldiers that meant to destroy Israel are lying on the ground like they did in the days of Sennacherib going against Israel, when they awoke in the morning and 180,000 of them were dead, they were all still. You could have created the same command for the annihilation of that army by saying, "Peace, be still." In the case of Sennacherib, the angel of the Lord destroyed them. In the case of Christ, it says he's going to slay them with the breath of his lips. So there's another possibility. Remember when my first literal demonstration was like this, because that's breath. But what if he went like, this was the literal part of my dream that I saw. What if he went like this? And in that breath, removed all the breath from every soldier in the opposing armies. He just takes the breath out of their lungs with an inhalation. Well, this is pure speculation. I'm not teaching this as if this is what we know he will do. Just trying to think about a little bit, use imagination to think about what it might mean for Jesus to destroy the wicked with the breath of his lips. He could say something simple like "die." Or there may be something else involved. What David said when he went after Goliath is, "Who is this heathen dog that would defy the armies of the living God?" I mean, such a dramatic statement. Who is this heathen? He's a little shepherd boy. Probably half of Goliath's height almost. And he says, "Who is this heathen dog that would defy the armies of the living God?" So David didn't use much more than a stone. And Christ is figured in Daniel as a stone. This time hitting the image on his feet, because all the history of mankind and his desire to take control of the kingdoms of men collapses at once under the authority of Christ's intervention into the affairs and politics of men. It collapses at once, and that image falls, as we know in the story of Daniel in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, is the way it happens. But in all of this, the point today for us, the takeaway, is that you and I are included. Our salvation will bring us into that host of people who will enable Christ to take control of the world. The saints are included, which is why, and we'll make a reference back to this psalm again, I've referred to it at length before we even went there and read it. Who is this King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. So his glory are the resurrected saints, and they are Michael when they stand up in the eyes of the nations. The Lord of hosts, he is this King of glory. In other words, it's his hosts that are his glory and his crown, his bride. So who is like God stands up coming in clouds? And it says in several references, and we're going to get to this next week, but I want to show you an interesting series of pictures on this. You may have seen this before. I can't remember whether I've shown this here or not. It's borrowed from another series I did on prophetic images, but it's just too interesting. And then we'll go into the scriptural side of it next week. We've got just enough time to do this. In clouds of glory is a phrase used to depict Christ's coming. He comes in clouds of glory. We'll see those verses next week. And that's the formation of Christ's strength. So there are other verses in the Psalms and in the prophets that refer to his bride as his strength, in the same way that Jean is my strength at home. I've got a lot of strength at home in my wife. She was given to me as a help who is suited to me. You have yours and they have theirs. But in my case, she's been a tremendous strength to me all my life. And even, I think, if you're not married to a man who is yet turned his attention toward God, you can be his strength in a natural sense. And even spiritually, though he may not believe, you can apply spiritual strength to his life, which will benefit him all the days of his life, and may, in fact, in the end, convert him with a gentle and quiet, the imperishable jewel of a gentle and quiet spirit. So strength doesn't necessarily have to be noisy. It can be, as the strength was in Jesus, gentle and quiet. So it says concerning this world that without Christ was not anything made that was made. John tells us that. So, question, if he comes in clouds of glory, and you're talking about clouds, you'd have to ask, how are clouds made? And this is now speaking about literal clouds. Well, the answer to that question is they don't know how clouds are made. I said that in one location one time, and a young Christadelphian man that came up to me, and he says, yes, they do. It's the water cycle, you know? It evaporates and the clouds form. That's not what this means. Physiologically, they really don't know. There are 3 theories you can read about in Wikipedia, but if there are 3 theories, as Einstein pointed out, that means they don't know. If they knew, it would only take one explanation and everybody would know. So they don't know how clouds are made. And you think about it, if you take a hose and put it into a mist form and spray it up in the air, what happens to those particulates of water? They blow away. They don't coalesce. They just dissipate. And they dry up, they evaporate. But they rise into the atmosphere and they coalesce. There's some remarkable physical laws that affect that may have to do with all sorts of other things. Sun radiation from the sun, some kind of electrical current that exists in the relationship of those particles in the air, things like that. But they don't know how they're made, but there they are. Let's take a look at a series of clouds, and then we'll close and pick this up next week. This is what clouds look like. So those little pieces, those little bits of water came together in the heavens, and everybody could see them, and they're beautiful. They're cirrus clouds. There's different kinds of clouds. There's stratus clouds. These are interesting. Lenticular clouds. Wish we could see those around here. I think they're more out in desert regions in the west. There's another lenticular cloud, like a flying saucer. Look at that one. That's enough to make you believe in flying saucers if you're inclined toward superstition. Look at those. John, you look like you may have seen clouds like that out west, have you?
Yes, that is a range of mountains to
Oh, you recognize the mountains.
the east of San Diego. I wish I could remember the name of the area, but there are what? It is over the desert.
But look at the clouds. They're amazing. And then these are called mammatus clouds. That's pretty interesting looking. I'm kind of thankful. I've never seen a sky like that. These are called ominous clouds. That's not the scientific term for it. That's just what I think that looks like. That looks ominous. It's a type of cloud. This is an enormous cloud. And again, that's not the scientific term. This is a humongous cloud, to use the Latin term for it. And if I ever saw a cloud like that, I think I would get in my car like these people are doing and drive away from that. There are dark clouds. There are very dark clouds. There are thick dark clouds. These are back up a little. They're in quotes because these are scriptural expressions. So, and they're talking about climate, political climate in the Bible. There are dark clouds. There are very dark clouds. There are thick dark clouds. There are rain clouds. What a photograph this is. Just look at that cloud with this little rainstorm coming down in a column. There are fiery clouds. Clouds that at the end of the day are lit up with the red spectrum of light, and they look like they're on fire. And there will be literal fiery clouds when Christ uses them for his judgment in the form of a fiery whirlwind. There are dust clouds. Look at that cloud. That's one a little bit more bound to the dust of which we are made, so maybe appropriately correlated to us and the way a dust cloud looks. There are sunlit clouds and bright clouds. And so with that array of clouds as an introduction, what we want to do next week is begin a very close look at all the scriptures that describe Michael not just standing up, but coming in clouds. And what we want to do is understand that entirely as a figure of speech in the Bible, so that when we read Matthew 24, we understand exactly what Jesus is referring to. There's no question anymore. So that's the goal. We'll pick it up here next week.